Hi everyone. Delighted to welcome you all to this session. Really excited about it. So my name is Elaine Toomey. I'm a lecturer in the School of Allied Health in the University of Limerick, and I'm also Research Associate of Cochrane Ireland and Evidence Synthesis Ireland. I'm really excited to introduce you to this session on living evidence. I think this is particularly important for navigating uncertainty when questions and evidence are ever changing so quickly. And I suppose particularly relevant for the past year when we're thinking about the speed in which COVID evidence has changed and progressed. I'm really thrilled to introduce our speakers. Our speaker today for this session is Dr. Tari Turner. So Dr. Tari Turner is the Director of Evidence and Methods of the Australian National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force. She's also a Senior Research Fellow at Cochrane Australia and Co-Editor-in-Chief of Health Research Policy and Systems. Dr. Turner will deliver a short presentation followed by a discussion. So due to time difference, we have to record this particular session and we won't be able to take questions from the audience, but I'll be asking some questions that will hopefully be of your interest. So I'd like to hand over to Tari now.
Thanks very much, Elaine. And thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you today. I'm delighted to be here. And I agree, Elaine, this is a fantastic topic for a colloquium or a symposium, rather, navigating uncertainty. This is what we've all been doing both professionally and personally for the last 15 months, isn't it? I was reflecting on this topic, and I think that I'd like to suggest in this talk that perhaps living evidence might be a GPS for navigating uncertainty. I think a GPS, a global positioning system, is a tool that can help us navigate. It's not necessarily a tool that we need for all circumstances. If you're walking your dog around the block, maybe you don't need a GPS. But for some tools, a GPS is vital and has really made a big difference to the way we travel. And equally, I'd like to suggest that living evidence is a tool that can help us navigate uncertainty. And we'll talk a bit more later on about the situations in which I think living evidence approaches are particularly relevant. I want to start just by acknowledging my interests, and particularly by acknowledging the Indigenous owners of the land on which I'm recording this presentation today. I'm based in the Dandenong Ranges outside of Melbourne in Australia, and the Indigenous owners of the land on which I am delivering this presentation are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to acknowledge and respect their elders, past, present and future. As Elaine mentioned, I'm the Director of Evidence and Methods for the Australian National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force. And I'll speak a bit later about the work we've been doing around living guidelines for COVID care. I should acknowledge too that I'm on the executive for the Australian Living Evidence Consortium. I'm a Senior Research Fellow from Cochrane Australia, and I've had the privilege of working on Project Transform, which many of you will be aware of, and the steering group, part of the steering group for the Living Evidence Network. A lot of the thinking and the projects I'm going to present to you today are based on the work of many people who've contributed to each of those initiatives and to others. And so, of course, I want to acknowledge their contributions to that work. As a little indication of the kind of size of team it takes to do some of this work, this is photos of some of the contributors to the National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force. This is a huge body of work, and I know that many people in Cochrane UK and other areas of Cochrane have also contributed to this concept of living evidence and the development of the methods that I'm going to talk about today. So thank you for that. I'm going to start by talking briefly about what living evidence is, what living evidence looks like in Cochrane, and then talk through some examples of where I think living evidence has some significant contributions to make to navigating uncertainty. The simplest definition that we use of what living evidence is just that this living evidence syntheses, which are continually updated to reflect all the best available evidence. It's a simple idea that essentially evidence syntheses, be they systematic reviews or evidence-based guidelines or perhaps evidence-based policy briefs, should continually reflect all the evidence that would be useful to a decision maker who was looking at that synthesis. I want to acknowledge up front that this is not rocket science. This is not a new idea, but it is an idea that I think is quite powerful. It's also important to say that this is an idea that has its roots a long way in the past. The great call to action that Archie Cochrane gave It's surely a great criticism of our profession that we have not organised a critical summary by specialty or subspecialty, adapted periodically of all relevant randomised controlled trials. Incorporates that important phrase, adapted periodically, reflecting the knowledge that, as my colleague Julian Elliott says, science never sleeps. There are always new RCTs that need to be incorporated to update our evidence synthesis. The work of living evidence also draws on important work undertaken by Paul Garner, Sally Hopewell and others around updating of systematic reviews and thinking about when it's appropriate and when it's necessary to update systematic reviews. It also builds on foundations of work undertaken by James Thomas, Ananol Storr and others to develop the technologies and processes and ways of involving people that enable us to efficiently update reviews. This diagram here is developed to reflect a living guideline process, but I think it equally applies to living systematic reviews as well. The top half of the diagram is what we might refer to as a traditional model of updating, or what I might refer to as a many mountains model. Those of you who've conducted a systematic review will recognise the process of developing a scope for a review or a guideline, undertaking the evidence synthesis, creating the document, publishing, whether it be a systematic review or a guideline, taking a deep breath and perhaps dusting your hands and walking away for a period, and then the process that happens with that review or guideline becoming increasingly out of date over time. Then when you come back to update the guideline or the review in 2, 3, 7 years, it's really the same process as starting again from scratch. Methods have changed. There's a great body of new research to incorporate. And so the process of doing the update can be as much work as doing the original review. A living evidence model has that first same step of climbing the mountain. But the idea is then once we climb the mountain, we keep on the plateau rather than waiting a couple of years or longer to look at what new evidence is published. We continuously survey the literature, and as new relevance research is published, we incorporate it in what's hopefully a set of smaller but more frequent updates to the review. Our experience so far suggests that this model holds, and that while it varies between different topic areas, it can be more efficient to do the initial review or guideline process and then to stay up here on the plateau, updating methods and content in small chunks rather than in one huge gulp. Fundamentally, the point of living evidence is to support a system that delivers the latest research to point of care or to policy decision making in near real time, driving better care and health outcomes. And here we see living evidence sitting at the centre of an evidence ecosystem. What's described here is dynamic evidence summaries, which are continually updated and used to inform healthcare decision making. So what does living evidence look like within Cochrane? Essentially, a living approach to a Cochrane review can be applied to any review type, whether that's an intervention review or a qualitative or diagnostic review. A Cochrane Living Systematic Review retains the core systematic review methods, but also includes additional living systematic review specific methods which are pre-specified in the protocol. This includes an explicit and a priori commitment to frequent searching and updating, and starts with a standard baseline review, so that climbing the mountain phase is undertaken in the same way as you would for an existing review, but additional methods are included or appended within that review to describe how you will then continue to search, screen the literature, and include and update the review. In most Cochrane Living Systematic Reviews, searches are conducted monthly, and there's a minor update to the review, which tells the reader what's happening every month. That might be we've rerun our searches and there is no additional evidence to include, or we've rerun our searches and there are 3 new small studies that are unlikely to change the conclusions but will be incorporated at some time in the future, or there's a new study that we think is particularly relevant and this review will be republished. The decision to republish the review is therefore informed by the evidence. When there are important changes to the content of the review is republished, but in the meantime, the reader is kept continually up to date as there are any changes to the evidence base. Cochrane has always really led the way around updating systematic reviews and had a model which has enabled that from the beginning. Cochrane's also done a lot of thinking around this idea of living mode, that not all systematic reviews need to be living at all, but that also reviews might move in and out of living mode, depending on the context, the importance of the question, and the uncertainty. Currently, there are 12 Cochrane Living Systematic Reviews and 9 protocols, the majority of which have been developed in late 2020 and early 2021, reflecting the uptake of these approaches within Cochrane and more broadly. We wouldn't suggest that living systematic reviews are appropriate for all questions. And indeed, we suggest 3 criteria be considered when you're deciding whether you might like to undertake a living evidence approach. Firstly, that the review question is a priority for decision making. It's an important question that decision makers care about. Secondly, that the certainty in the existing evidence is low or very low, that it's not clear from the evidence that's currently available what the right choice or decision should be. And thirdly, that there's likely to be new research evidence emerging, so it's worth undertaking continuous surveillance of the literature to find that new evidence as it emerges. In our evaluation of the pilot living systematic reviews within Cochrane, it also became very clear that capacity and resources within the author and editorial team to maintain the living systematic review for a period of time, perhaps say a year at least, is really important. Having a committed and capable team who understand the processes and are willing to commit the time and effort to make monthly updates to searches and to handle issues around copy editing and quality is vital to the success of these approaches. There's guidance for teams who might be considering undertaking a Cochrane Living Systematic Review at this website, or if you just Google Cochrane Living Systematic Review guidance, you'll find it. So now I want to talk a little bit more about some examples of living evidence and when it might be useful and the implications for healthcare decision makers. I want to start to talk about one of my favourite Cochrane Living Systematic Reviews. Of course, like children, you shouldn't have favourites, but this is one of mine. This is a review led by Rebecca Hodder and Luke Wolfenden from the Public Health Group. It was one of our pilot systematic reviews and addressed a really important question, interventions for increasing fruit and vegetable consumption in children. The review team for this group were incredibly enthusiastic and very keen, and the editorial base was very supportive too. I'd encourage you, if you have a moment, to investigate the What's New table for this review, which I'm sure you can't read the detail here, but gives you a sense of the kind of processes that are involved. Regular searches and updates, and then republications of the review. In this really important topic area, with a great deal of uncertainty and a rapidly emerging evidence base, this review team was able to undertake republications of the review within a 3-month time period, which is pretty amazing. It also indicates some of the challenges of living methods. So whilst the team were fantastic and able to maintain that process for a significant period of time, ultimately they were limited by funding for the period of time they were able to maintain that. And that's an open question, and they're hoping to get some more and be able to continue. But there are real challenges to maintaining reviews over longer periods of time that need to be taken into account when making decisions about whether or not to use living evidence approaches. Another example of the approach of living evidence approaches being applied is in guidelines. And I'd love to draw your attention to the Living Stroke Guidelines developed by the Australian Stroke Foundation. These were, we think, the world first living guidelines. And they've been living now for more than 18 months. It's a huge guideline, which includes more than 300 recommendations covering 88 topics and really all elements of stroke care. The team undertake continuous evidence surveillance, and we've just about completed an evaluation looking at what that continuous evidence surveillance process has meant in terms of changes to recommendations and inclusion of new evidence, but also what it's meant for the guideline development team and the many clinicians and others who are involved in reviewing the evidence. it's looking really positive, and I look forward to sharing with you, perhaps next year, what that evaluation found. But the guidelines themselves demonstrate really clearly one of the important values that living approaches can have. So if you'll indulge me to just give an example. An earlier version of the guidelines specified that for patients who have had a stroke, the window for providing thrombolysis was up to 4.5 hours after the stroke onset. So that was the window in which thrombolysis was felt to be effective. In May 2019, a new trial was published, Extend, which demonstrated that this was likely to be an underestimate of the effective window for thrombolysis. In July of that year, a systematic review was published, which incorporated the results of that Extend trial with the existing evidence base. And in August, the revised guideline was released for consultation, including an updated recommendation. That guideline went through the Australia's National Health and Medical Research Council consultation period and a whole range of other processes, and the final guideline, updated guideline, was released in November. And that in the new guideline, the recommendation was that the window for thrombolysis was up to 9 hours after stroke onset. In a country like Australia, that makes a big difference given the rural and regional populations that our health services serve, and means that many more people are eligible for thrombolysis treatment. So in a period of just months, a living guideline was able to substantively change one of its primary recommendations based on a change in the evidence. And this is very different from what we see in many guideline development processes, where an update might be 2 or 3 or 4 years later. I want to spend just a little bit of time now talking about our most recent work on the Australian Living COVID-19 guidelines. We're currently producing national evidence-based guidelines for clinical care of people with COVID-19. And our team's conducting continuous evidence surveillance to find new evidence and to produce rapid, rigorous guidelines that incorporate it. The task force itself includes representation from more than 32 peak health professional bodies, which cover the breadth of all the clinical disciplines that are involved in providing care to people with COVID-19. And our aim was to provide a trusted voice that provided a single point of information for care of patients with COVID-19. So what does this look like in reality? Well, it means that we're actually searching for the literature every day. We're screening new publications and appraising their quality, updating evidence profiles and summary of findings tables every week. These evidence summaries are then taken to our guideline panels, who consider the new evidence and draft recommendations, which are then taken to our guideline leadership group for approval, and then to our steering committee. This process takes 2 weeks from the beginning of identifying new evidence to publication of new recommendations within MAGIC. Just to give you a sense of the workload involved, you saw the picture at the beginning of those 200 odd people who are contributing. We have, as I mentioned, 32 member organisations, 16 standing expert panels, 252 people contributing. The guidelines were launched in the 4th of April last year and have subsequently been updated weekly for 52 weeks. We've had 37 major updates to those guidelines. The guidelines now include 124 recommendations, and we estimate that we have 360 hours of volunteer time each week into the updating of those guidelines. We've screened more than 8,000 citations. In fact, since I put this slide set together, that's well and truly past 9,000. And we have been amazed at people's willingness to contribute to this undertaking and acknowledge the work that Cochrane's been doing, which underpins many of our recommendations too. The work of the task force has demonstrated that it is feasible to do very rapid guidelines on issues of real importance. So where to next? If living evidence is a GPS, then there are some areas where we think we know where we are. We're pretty clear that not all reviews and guidelines need to be living, and not all the time. But that in areas where review questions are a priority, where the existing certainty in the evidence is low or very low, and there's likely to be new evidence, living approaches can help. We've also established in a range of different contexts that with the right teams, established methods and rigor can be maintained at speed. There's no need to trade off quality and timeliness. We also know that there are lots of things we don't know. The exploration is still very much just beginning. I've got loads of questions as a methodologist around what we should have as criteria for determining how frequently we search for new research, what our thresholds are for incorporating new evidence into analyses, how we decide when we'll update recommendations of guidelines, and for Cochrane reviews, how and when to move out of living mode and how to pre-specify what those criteria might be. The Cochrane Consumer Group, led Sophie Hill and Bronwyn Murner and Annie Sinnott, are doing some great work around how consumers can be involved in living guidelines and living systematic reviews, and the model might be quite different. So it'd be great to explore that further. There are lots of open questions around knowledge translation for living systematic reviews. How do we design models that enable us to translate what might be continuously changing outcomes from reviews? And I think there are heaps more opportunities for both more automation and improved efficiency from other mechanisms of involving other people in the process of living evidence. So I'm going to pause there, although the truth is I could keep talking about living evidence for ages. And I also just wanted to flag before I finish that I'm aware that this kind of environment doesn't let us catch up over coffee and the tables outside the doors as we might in a different format. But I'd love you to send me an email at tari.turner@monash.edu if you'd like to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tari. So that was really interesting and really, I suppose just so pertinent in the time that we've been living in the last year, and just to commend you and all the work you've done and all the team as well. That's an incredible amount of time and effort. So thank you very much. It's great we do have time for questions, so you can talk more about it, which is brilliant. And I won't talk too much, but just a couple of things that struck me. So when I love the idea of it being a GPS tool so that it's not necessarily always needed. And I think coming to this, I had always thought, my systematic reviews are terrible because I never get to update them as much as I'd like. So, that we should be doing this for everything. So I think that's really interesting and helpful. Just could you talk a little bit more maybe about the role of, technology and AI and how that is being used or could be used to make things, make this more doable, I suppose?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And certainly the technological work that's underpinned the evidence pipeline, James Thomas and his team, has really enabled a lot of this work. But I think we are just at the beginning of understanding how technology can make this process more efficient. And there's lots of teams right around the world looking at different approaches for automating different elements of the process, whether it's that search process that evidence pipeline is so great on, or further downstream processes around how we extract data, and even right through to how we publish data. So using platforms like Magic or other online platforms that enable us to quickly update guideline recommendations is part of that too. I think too, Cochrane, just while we're on that publishing end of the thing, Cochrane has a real advantage in this space because we're used to publishing updates of reviews, which is not something that many journal publications have the opportunity to do. So there's questions there too around how non-Cochrane reviews might be made living, but Cochrane really does have an advantage in that space because it's part of the way we think about this process already.
Thanks, because I suppose when I thought of this, when I heard of living evidence and living reviews, initially I thought they were fully automated and that there was, reviews that would just automatically update themselves and then just kick out the things and screen. And I was like, that's brilliant. So then when I, reading into it, I suppose a lot more human resources at the moment needed. So I suppose exciting to see where things will bring us with technology, I suppose. So on that, I suppose a little bit, I guess I was, struck by the size of the team involved with it. And I suppose just thinking about the resources and that type of thing, especially for some of us, where research maybe isn't a sustainable career, or you're on a project for 3 years and then you move on to another one. Any thoughts in terms of how we enable things to be more sustainable when the careers that fuel them and do them aren't sustainable maybe, or are less so?
Yeah, and that's definitely a challenge. So perhaps just to connect back to your point about the technology, I think the more we can use technology to do what is perhaps I don't like the phrase, but the grunt work, so that we can free up the people, the resources we do have to focus on where human brains are really needed, the better, right? So we certainly need to do that. And I think that the work of Rebecca Hodder's team and others who are doing living systematic reviews has demonstrated that the model's really flexible. So they've had people come in and out of the team who are doing the living systematic review over time. So not expecting that the author team will remain exactly the same for the whole life of the living systematic review. If you've got people who are on placements for 12 months, they might be able to step into the author team and then step out. But if you have a group of authors, there's a bit more flexibility to allow people to take on certain roles for certain periods of time and then move on. And I think too, acknowledging that we can have reviews move in and out of living mode, so that it's not a crisis if we can't maintain living mode all the time. And we should be looking for how we can make that sustainable. But I don't think there are necessarily any easy answers there, but being clear about how long we are aiming to maintain a review in living mode, how we'll decide when it will come in or out of that mode might be part of the picture.
Thanks a million. And I suppose one of the things, and maybe I'm obsessed with resources now or capacity or something, I'm not, but just a few things that have struck me. And I guess what you were saying there about, people after they've done a big project, then they kind of breathe and they, take a break from it and stuff. And I suppose, do we maybe need to rethink how we plan for things, and even in terms of submitting timelines to funders? We typically kind of submit that, we're going to do this review and then it's going to be done and we're going to move on. Do we need to work with funders a little bit more to understand that actually we're going to need sustained resources over a period of time, where they might not be familiar with that? And have you experienced with that, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think ideally it would be great to have sort of ongoing, perhaps lower levels of funding for a longer period of time. And doesn't fit neatly into many of our research funding models, though, which are really time bound. I think there are definitely unanswered questions there. I think some of the other thinking we can do is about how we might frame up author teams in a different way. So not expecting that 2 or 3 people will own the review and be entirely responsible for it, but perhaps having broader author teams who can contribute in smaller amounts over a longer period of time, and who can come in and out a little bit more along the way. I think that too applies to questions around consumer engagement. So we're just thinking through around whether there are different models for involving consumers that might allow them to have that longer term involvement, particularly in the context of guidelines, where they can focus on particular areas and not necessarily have the same depth of engagement in a short period, but a longer term engagement.
And I suppose just some of, similar to that, I suppose, thinking about what you were saying earlier about the uncertainty piece of it, is it, or have you experienced it much, say, with the COVID work, where things have flipped? So it's not necessarily that, our evidence is getting stronger, but now we're actually saying the opposite thing. And how have you dealt with that? And especially with those tighter timelines, how have you found
that?
Yeah.
So that's a great question. And it's one we get asked quite a lot. And I'm really interested as a kind of a knowledge translation person around that question too. We've got some really interesting data coming out of the stroke guidelines, which suggests that that's probably not what's happening. And it's not our experience in COVID either. So what we are seeing is not so much the direction of recommendation changing over time, but that the certainty increases over time. So we've had several examples where we've had low certainty evidence, which has increased over time to a higher certainty. And we've had a very few examples where there's been low certainty evidence for an effect, which has changed to low certainty evidence against an effect. But we really haven't seen any examples where we've had strong evidence for or against effect, which has been flipped by later evidence to strong evidence, one or the other. And I guess that's not unexpected. Using models like GRADE, you don't come up with a strong recommendation in a grade-based approach based on small studies where there's imprecision. So I think the model is actually a bit more robust than we thought it might be. And we're not seeing the flip-flopping that we were concerned we might.
Brilliant. So I think we could probably stay here talking all day and all night for you, Terry, and all day for me. But unfortunately, we need to kind of wrap up this session now. So just thank you so very much, Tara, for such an interesting session. And please do contact Tara afterwards, as she says, if you have further questions. And I'm just going to hand back over to Martin Burton, who's going to chair the next session for us. So thanks so much again, Tara, and take care.
Thank you.